Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session, which is focusing on China, and more specifically, is focusing on China's trade relations and where they're going. Let me make a couple of preliminary remarks before introducing Chen Deming and Pascal Lamy, the Director General of the WTO. I remember from my time in GATT the application of China to join GATT. That application was an explicit recognition of the need for China to become part of the global economy. It was an explicit recognition, too, of the market economy system and the benefits of competition, which were expressly referred to in the application in a very blunt and honest way. Even the most optimistic of us in those days could not have foreseen the amazing result of that membership and indeed the process leading to membership of the WTO. We're celebrating 10 years of that membership today. It's relevant to make that point because the WTO has formed the basis upon which a great deal of the reform which has taken place so successfully in the Chinese economy has been developed. A reform which is based upon a rule-based international trading system, which has been upheld and developed over the years of membership, more latterly by Pascal Lamy, who is trying to drive the Doha round to completion. It is fair to say, therefore, that the globalization process, which China plays such a fundamental part in, is itself rooted in the multilateral trading system and the rules and disciplines which have been accepted by its members. It is the one great advance in multilateral governance since the inspired period of institution building that followed the Second World War and the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. Bob Zoellick was to have been with us today, but unfortunately was trapped initially in Washington, and more latterly, apparently, he's trapped in Frankfurt. So where he will be trapped next, I have no idea, but he's not here. So we will be developing our discussion on the issue of trade and China. During the course of this morning's discussion, President Sarkozy referred to the presidency of the G20 and the challenges ahead of it. I was surprised that he did not mention concluding the Doha round, because the Doha round is fundamentally important for the credibility of the multilateral trading system, and most observers believe that if it is not substantively concluded during the first half of this year, allowing the second half for scheduling and technical matters, it will not be concluded easily in the future, not least because next year we have a US election. There is no country in the world with a greater interest, it would seem to me, in multilateralism and the Doha round than China. And one of the questions we will be debating is whether China is going to lead in this vital period immediately ahead. Because leadership is certainly required, and leadership is required of the major developed countries, but also, I would say, by China. First of all, I'm going to ask the Minister to offer some reflections on his experience and his view of what has happened in the last 10 years as a result of the opening up of trade. Minister.
Thank you, Chairman.
Respected Mr. Sutherland and Mr. Lamy, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. I thank to the forum for this session on the accession of China into WTO over 10 years. This is in line with the theme of this forum, because 10 years ago we joined the WTO and joined a set of new rules. After 10 years, China has made significant contribution to the world economy and has weathered the financial storm quite well. Now the world economy is on its way to recovery, but the toxic assets are not resolved. The sovereign debt is still an issue in Europe. Emerging countries are facing the risk of inflation and the cost of labor going up, and regulatory environment is uncertain yet. Therefore, the world hopes that there will be a set of shared norms to ensure the recovery, and therefore I would like to share with you some of my views on the 10-year in WTO and how we want to develop in this new world and how to develop multilateral new norms. There are three things I would like to talk about. First of all, our accession was a milestone of reform in China. We started reform in 1978. We chose a path of market economy with the Chinese characteristics. We faced many difficulties and challenges. The Chinese government chose the path of accepting multilateral rules in industry, agriculture and service and intellectual property areas. We have undertaken fundamental commitments. In 2001, we became a former member of WTO. I think this was a courageous and a tough choice we made. Mr. Sutherland and Mr. Lamy and Mr. Zoellick, who were trapped somewhere, are all witnesses and participants of this process. You have seen how we've done this. The past 10 years has been a period of reform and development through reform. We have been a new member, and then we have become a driver too. We have paid dearly for the entrance ticket, and we have lived through the frustration of growth. We are now become a mature, a legal player in the organization. Our average tax tariff was reduced from 15% to 9.8%. We opened over 100 trade sectors. We've gone through the largest scale legislation work. We revised, abolished, and launched over 3,000 laws and regulations. At the same time, we have learned and adopted market practices. We have established a stable and predictable trading system. The environment is much more open. We have introduced non-discriminatory and transparency of the WTO principles into our economic systems. We have improved our awareness of the market, the rule of law, and intellectual property rights have become accepted in China. The Chinese government has changed its function, becoming a servant to the economy. This has brought about fundamental changes in China. The second thing I want to talk about, our accession is good for the world. It is 10 years of sharing benefits and joint development. Although some countries were doubtful whether we were able to honor our promises, but 10 years have passed. Answer is there on the wall. Our export has increased by 4.9 times. Import increased by 4.7 times. GDP nearly doubled. During this time, we have seen the fastest growing period of the Chinese economy. The income of our residents has improved too, from a per capita 800 US dollars to $2,500 US dollars in 2009, averaging about 10%. Over 200 million people got rid of their poverty. China has become part of the world economy, bringing mutual benefits to other countries too. Last year, our goods trade import was more than 1.4 trillion. We became the second largest importer, making up about 10% of the overall world trade. We absorbed 7 trillion 700 billion US dollars in foreign investment. There was thousands of foreign companies set up in China. Of the Fortune 500, more than 480 have set up in China or have business there. Of the 29 categories of trade sectors have been open now, and also R&D centers set up in China by foreign companies number more than 1,400. Foreign companies have participated in our economy and shared the benefits and opportunities that we've offered. China is now going international and investing overseas. More than 10 years ago, our overseas investment was less than 1 billion. Last year, it was nearly 60 billion. And therefore, that investment is bi-directional now and reaching an equilibrium point. We have maintained our contacts with developing countries and to reduce the gap between the South and the North. We have done what we can to honor our international obligations to promote the cooperation between South and North. We also participate in trade promotion. For 3 years, we provided unilateral tariff reduction of 50% for the poorest countries. So China has become the biggest import destination for the least developed countries. The third thing I want to talk about is that in the next 10 years, China will be even more open. We want to first of all thank the WTO as a big family. Thank you for accepting us. And it's clear to us that we made the right choice to join. We know to be open is not a slogan. There's going to be a series of complicated policy implementations. It's a combination of political will and wisdom. So we need a fairer, more efficient trading system that's conducive to the development of the world economy. And therefore, in the next 10 years, we will focus even more on joint development so that China will be developing together in global prosperity. Currently, our economic growth will maintain at the level about 8% and above. In the past 10 years, we averaged about 15% in the growth of our market. We believe the market growth will maintain that speed. So 10 years later, import in China will be more than the total of the world trade. And I think we have a market of 1.3 billion people, possibly 1.4 billion. So our development needs to be shared. So in the future, we'll be even more open. Starting from this year, we'll focus on Chinese companies investing overseas. We'll focus on buying more products from overseas. We want to help boost the consumption overseas. So these are 3 ways in which we want to share the development. And also, we've just decided on the next 5 years development plan. In that plan, we make it very clear that further opening up the Chinese market, there is a detailed plan. If you want to know, please ask us. Finally, I'd just like to say, Mr. Chairman asked me, WTO has a history of 60 years and more, and that experience tells us multilateral trading system is more important than bilateral agreements, bilateral trading agreements, because a multilateral system will be without prejudice, will be conducive to the prosperity of the world, and therefore multilateral trading agreements are seen by us as the foundation of a new system. Bilateral agreements will be a supplement to that. And therefore, although we've been with the organization for 10 years, we are still relatively new. The Doha round negotiation is a major part to the new norms in the new world. So if we can work together to make a breakthrough, make a progress, then world trade will be in a new, better environment. Thank you.
Pascal, could I ask you to reflect on the past, your experience of watching China adapting to multilateral trade and how it's been going?
Yeah, I'll try to do that very briefly, building on my own relationship with China, which really started when I negotiated China's term of accession to the WTO when I was European Commissioner in a previous life. I mean, among the multitude of events we've lived through for the last 40 years, a few of them are already in history books. China joining the WTO in 2001, 10 years ago, is today in history books. Now, why is it so among this myriad of events? Because it was a turning point. It was the moment where China's opening policy, which started with Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, became a binding international commitment. The WTO terms of agreement for China is the only area in the international system until now where China has ceded sovereignty. China has accepted in joining the WTO that 7 judges somewhere in Geneva make a decision whether China is right or wrong. Not only that, because the International Court in The Hague can do that, but China has accepted that if China is found wrong, then China will abide and change its behavior. And this is, in historical terms, a major change in China. And that decision was, and it's probably easier for me to talk about that than for my friend Deming. At the time, there was a big fight within the Chinese leadership whether this was right or wrong. Why? A, because, as I said, they were crossing the Rubicon of binding international commitments. Second, China had to join WTO in terms which were much tougher than any other developing country belonging to the WTO. Chinese terms of accession in the industrial tariffs are 4 times lower than Brazil or India. The average agricultural Chinese tariff in 2001 was lower than the EU average agricultural tariff. Now, I'm not saying this to play with numbers. I'm saying this because for part of the Chinese leadership at the time, that was a clear discrimination against China. And As you may know, if you know a bit of Chinese history, the reference to unequal treaties of commerce in the 19th century and this whole problem of the relationship between China and the West played a big role in igniting this debate. At the end of the day, the position of notably Zhu Wongji at the time prevailed, and the pill was swallowed. But mind you, it was a difficult pill to swallow. China did a good deal in paying for an insurance policy against protectionism, which was a clever thing to do, because had China not joined the WTO, the rise of China in international trade would have been terribly bumpy. EU, US, Japan, and many others would, for sure, have used anti-China trade instruments, and China joining the system was shielded from, so to say, unfair practices. But, again, at a price which was a very high price, and we might come back to that later in the discussion, which also may explain some of the difficulties we have in concluding the Doha round today. Now, I won't comment, I think Chen Deming gave you the numbers. The two most frequent asked questions, and I'm waiting for a lot of that for the 10th anniversary of China joining the WTO. As you know, Chinese love anniversaries. It's very important in their mind and in their system. First question, who won? Did China win? Did the rest of the world win? Did China lose? Did the rest of the world lose? That's what media like to hear. Now, the reality, the numbers are there. China won and the rest of the world won. Typical case of win-win game through better opening trade, more international division of labor, more efficiency, economies of scales, and so on. The numbers are there. Of course, China still has a trade surplus overall, but this is a macroeconomic issue, and as China progressively rebalances its own economic system, more to come in terms of China's imports as the domestic market grows. Second question, and I'll stop there, did China abide by its commitments? And the answer to this question is overall, yes. Like any other WTO member, overall, there are areas where there may be a bit of hesitation, a bit of doubt. Nobody has a totally clean nose in WTO, but what we have is a system that allows these, let's say, imperfections, some lawyers would say breaches, to be addressed through our implementation machinery. So, the jury on whether China has abided by its commitment or not, the jury is every day in the life of WTO, in committees, in the dispute settlement. And overall, I think the answer is right, not perfect certainly, and please remember that WTO disciplines do not cover each and every part of a business life. We have a net of discipline, but this net of discipline is quite a wide net. Progressively, the net size of the net is improving. We are catching more and more regulations, but the answer to this question has to be looked at, not at each and every practice of China in legislation, in regulation, in business practices, in the court system, but whether or not the disciplines which they have subscribed at the time are enforced. That's my answer to your question, Peter.
Thank you both very much for that very clear demonstration of the value to the world and to China of the multilateral trading system. And now to move to the present. You were with Premier Hu Jintao in Washington last week, Minister. You're also more conscious than anybody, probably in China, or certainly as much as anybody, of the importance of the Doha development round. It has taken 10 years and we still haven't reached a conclusion. And some people would say, with a degree of merit, that it's for the largest trading countries in the world to absolutely lead this to a satisfactory conclusion. And if we have, as many believe, only a matter of months before things become paralyzed by US electoral cycles, is China going to lead during the coming period of months? Because it's certainly part of what is required. I think the United States also has a significant leadership role, as many others do. But many people are concerned that the wider US-China relationship may taint or disturb this negotiation. And the deal needs to be delivered for China and for the world. And I wonder whether you can give us any view as to whether you think the Doha round will be concluded and what China's role will be in bringing it to a conclusion.
Mr. Chairman obviously has given me a difficult question. We are only 10 years into WTO, but I'll try my best. China and US have many mutual benefits, and there are different views and conflicts. That's true. President Hu visited the US. They held a small-scale and a larger-scale meeting. There were private dinners and state banquet. So there were many opportunities to talk. My understanding is that the two presidents identified common grounds. They both wanted to develop our partnership based on those common grounds. That will mean a good thing for companies and people of both countries, as well as the recovery of the world economy. In terms of a Doha round, indeed they talked about that. I think you must have seen the joint communique. In there, there's this sentence: leaders of both countries will ask their representatives to do cross-disciplinary talks and to lock in current achievement and to help conclude the round with a confident, fair and comprehensive result. Both sides have agreed that the participation of both representatives will be increased in order to bring a successful conclusion. So those were the words in the joint communique. China is a major player. Our ministry is the key leading party in China. I was in China. I talked to US officials in charge. We have also agreed to continue our contacts. The US has said that they will be prepared to send a working group at an appropriate time to continue our dialogues. So these are positive news. I'd just like to emphasize that there are two things that's special about the Doha round. First, it's multilateral. It's a multilateral trade negotiation. At the current stage, we need to focus on promoting progress multilaterally. We need to progress the talk on the text. The discussion, the multilateral discussions have been continuing. We are talking not just with the US, but also with many other countries. But the discussions need to serve the purpose of a multilateral negotiation, and they need to be open and transparent. Secondly, I would like to say the Doha talks are about development. Therefore, developing countries are relatively weaker. They tend to be very different in their circumstances. Therefore, our talks need to take into account of the interests of the developing countries. The world is still facing a difficult recovery. Our confidence in the Doha round need to be practical too. I think these things, if we can do well, then we do have hopes of being able to bringing it to a successful conclusion in the coming months. And I hope we should all work on this. Don't point fingers at each other. We need to cooperate. China will do its utmost. Thank you.
Before turning to Pascal for his reflections on that, I would simply say, if I may, this observation as an impartial observer at this stage. The United States drove most of the trade rounds that succeeded in bringing the trade system to where it is. And whilst they have fought their corner hard, they have also in the past compromised. They need to compromise again this time. But Chinese leadership in the round seems to be extremely important. And the price of failure of the round would be more, perhaps for China, than anybody else. So do you think that China has still some way to go in terms of the negotiation? Minister? Do you think that there is more? For an example, China will get an average 36% cut on tariffs, 40 to 50% from the EU and US, and is offering 22% itself. Now, admittedly, China was generous on its, or at least it had to accept difficult terms on accession, but it should mean that there's more room for maneuver.
The Doha round talks will benefit all members of WTO if it's successful. People often say to me, you are going to be the biggest beneficiary and therefore you need to do more. But we are a developing, emerging country. Of course we benefit. But it will cost us too in agriculture or non-agriculture, in the service industry too. But the overall development is linked to mandate. The mandate was locked in Hong Kong. This is a development round. Therefore, it needs to benefit more the developing countries, and also achievement that has been made, let's say whether it's 60, 70 or 80% of the progress, those need to be locked in. We shouldn't restart negotiations. Given that the last 20% of the negotiations will be tough for many countries, including China. Although our overall economy is number 2 in the world, but our per capita GDP is more than 100, and so we still have 150 million people living in poverty. Those are our difficulties, but we will try hard. For example, tariff reduction. The average custom tariffs is now only 9.8%. In the developed countries, it's about 6.8%. In other developing countries, their nominal tariff is about 46%. And therefore, if we continue to reduce tariffs without any prejudice, then China needs to participate proactively indeed. We need to base our negotiations on the agreed text already, but I hope obviously that countries that are facing difficulty will return to the discussion of the text. So China will do its best to promote the talks, but China will also make a judgment on what we are able to contribute, what we are going to benefit. In the end, the result's got to be every country benefits. That's my belief.
Pascal?
Well, in WTO, all members are equal, but some, as we all know, are more equal than others, and more major players, they're all equal, but some are more major than others. And it's probably the case of China and the US, just to name a few. So it should not be a surprise that in this remit of global economic governance, which is trade, the US-China relationship has become a major issue. There are many reasons for that, and I don't think we have time to expand. It's a fact. Second, the Doha round, which is the 9th round of multilateral trade negotiations since the beginning of the system after the Second World War in the last century, is the first round ever where some developing countries will pay a price in terms of market access in manufacturers, in agriculture, in services. In all previous rounds, developing countries never went as far as taking commitments that would increase their market access. They did a few things. They did bind their tariff. They did a tarification of various obstacles to trade which existed. They subscribed a number of rules on subsidies, on anti-dumping, on intellectual property. But it's the first time, this time, that emerging countries, not least developed countries, not all developed countries, but emerging countries will have to take cuts. And of course, for the reasons which we've already mentioned in the first part of the discussion, China will have to do that, and the starting point of China, because of its recent accession, is lower than the others. So they will have proportionally to do more than what other emerging countries are doing. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying, looking at the history of the negotiations and looking at the sort of change with this entail, this is a major issue. And a large part of this is already on the table. China has already accepted, with the formula which was agreed in 2008, to cut in its supply tariffs. It's not to come, it's already on the table. My own sense, and I'm not speaking for China, is that the system as a whole has a huge value for China. And that's the reason, by the way, why this tough decision was taken 10 years ago. I'm not saying China will pay any price to preserve the system. And, concluding the round and preserving the system have something to do with one another. If we were to fail in this negotiation, the system as a whole would certainly be damaged. Now, I'm not saying China will pay any price to conclude the round, because there are political limits. China has a political system with contingencies for which more open trade creates problem, and with constituencies for which more open trade is good news. I'm of the view that on what remains to be done, some major countries will have to do more and to take more. So we are now at a stage of the negotiation where the final lap implies that major players give more and take more. The only question is how much and what exactly is the balance between the give and takes. And this has to happen for the negotiation to conclude. Last point on the politics of this, and we heard Deming say that China is a developing country. There is a political problem there for some other players. What US viewers, what European viewers, what African viewers, what Brazilian viewers see of China on TV is booming China. It's Shanghai Expo, it's the Olympic Games, it's high-speed trains, it's brand new planes, it's Madame Nali in the final women at Melbourne. It's China shining all over the place. Now, China's position is that China remains a developing country. And in the WTO system, developing countries and developed countries are not exactly tailored the same way. And this political issue is with us, because governments who are accountable to their public opinion, to their parliaments, will need to take into account the view that China is booming, that China is a place where you've had 10% of growth for decades now, which is not always the way the Chinese leadership sees this within the system. China still has major domestic challenges in environment, in regional imbalances, in social imbalances, in the health system, in the pension system. Of course, that's not what you see of China on TV, but it is a reality, and how much of that is taken into account in the turbulences of domestic politics is a question which is still ahead of us.
Well, to make a couple of concluding remarks, the subject of trade negotiations, I once remember it coming up as a discussion piece for another organization, and a well-known political figure, I don't think he'd mind me quoting him, Henry Kissinger, made the observation that it's a boring subject. Well, perhaps it is a boring subject, but perhaps the most critical political decision that has to be taken for not merely China, but for the rest of the world in the next period of months, is whether the global leadership is fit for the task of providing evidence of will to conclude the Doha round. And I think it's been very evident from the excellent contributions which we've had this evening why that is the case. During the turmoil of economic destruction which we've had in recent years through the financial crisis and so on, the global economy has been significantly sustained by the integration of China and other countries into the global trading system. We have created that situation through a rule-based global economic system. If, as some would seek, we are to replace it by an increasing reliance on bilateral agreements, we will be back to the mercantilism of former centuries. And the globalization process, which has brought so much good, particularly for the poorest people on the planet, many of them, will have been lost. So I think that the message which we've heard this evening from the panelists is something to be approved. And I would like you to signify your approval in the ordinary way for what they've been saying. Thank you very much.